they understand the fragility of their system. And we see this in all sorts of signs from Chinese leaders. You know, it's not just a question of putting their kids in Harvard, but it's a question of more and more money coming out of the country and the ferociousness of official media critics. And so I think that that is a leading indicator that the communist system only has so long left in China.
The President Ma mentioned the one country, two districts. And you know, I think it is appropriate or it's very dangerous for Taiwan. Above all, the timing is the China never changed the power in this year. I think they are very struggle and very battle. How do you think?
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to be like an academic, you would say that what Ma said recently is really just an outgrowth of the Kuomintang's policy that, you know, there is one China, it is the Republic of China. And of course, that means that there are two areas in that country. You know, there's Taiwan and there's the other guys, but they're all part of the same country. But this is not just a question of academic theory, of course. This is a question of practical power politics. And yes, of course, saying it and saying it in that way is dangerous. And so I think that, you know, clearly people in Taiwan need to say, no, this isn't right. You know, there are two countries. There's that big country called China, and there's one called Taiwan. So, you know, in a sense, I'm saying, if you're the academic, if you're the analyst like I am, you could say, well, you know, it's no big deal. That's what they've been saying for the last 60 years. But no, it does really matter because it's not only a question of what the theory of what you say, but it's when you say it and how you say it and to whom you say it. And Ma did those in ways which, of course, made everybody so nervous. And so it's up to the Taiwan people to say, nope, that's not what we elected you for. And so this is the way it is. We are Taiwan and they're China.
Gordon, let me just ask you two quick questions. First, there's both confusion on Capitol Hill and concern about two issues in Taiwan. And the confusion is about this notion of the 92 consensus. You know, most people on Capitol Hill don't understand anything about what that is, but it is, you know, a topic that keeps being brought up again, etc. So, you know, can you address that just for a second about the 92 consensus? And I can, you know, maybe point out why that is so, I think, dangerous, as you said about this. The clarity coming from the people of Taiwan is so important. So to talk about a 92 consensus, where you have the former president, who supposedly was in charge then, saying, you know, what are you talking about? We didn't have any kind of consensus. So can you address that? And then the second part is, and I run into this all the time in Washington, particularly when we are trying to be of great help and assistance to Taiwan when there are arms deals. What we run into repeatedly is this notion of these spies that continue to crop up in Taiwan's military. So can you address that and what you think and see that being a problem here in Washington as we're trying to move this Taiwan, you know, aircraft modernization act through?
Yeah, this issue of we shouldn't sell arms to Taiwan because they'll just end up in China is something that you also hear to a lesser extent with regard to Japan.
Right.
And it's come up in connection with the possible sale of an F-22 Raptor to the Japanese. So this is something which is not unique to Taiwan, but it is more of a problem for Taiwan because there have been more instances of Taiwanese military officers caught spying for China. I think part of it is sort of a natural result that when you don't make strong policy declarations to support Taiwan, that military officers and others on the island are going to say, well, we're lost anyway, so, you know, why don't I just sell this and make a little bit of money on the side? So that is, I think, a natural consequence of feckless American policy. And if we had a stronger policy in clear tones, and supported by arms sales and other things, then I think that you have the Taiwan military have fewer and fewer cases of spying for China, because China would not appear to be the inevitable hegemon. So yeah, that's a problem. We got to acknowledge it, but it's really, I think, a problem that stems with American policy, not with Taiwan spying.
Well, can I respond to that? I will, having sat on Capitol Hill for many of these conversations, I will say this. It doesn't help the case when Taiwan can't make up their mind and will not fund their own defense.
Sure.
And what we're faced with as Americans trying to promote Taiwan and trying to, improve its defense, is this notion that there's not a clear message coming from Taiwan about their own defensive needs. Sometimes they'll play it forward and say, oh, we need all these packages and we'll fund it. And the next thing we know, in Washington, the money is yanked from it. We don't know if the money's there. So there's room for mischief in Washington because of the clarity coming from the Taiwan side itself, from the administration itself. And unfortunately, I had to sit through one of those meetings when I still worked in the Senate, where one day they wanted every package that was available and all the money was there. The next day, when the tide turned in Taiwan and had a new president, well, they didn't want to have any of that stuff. So that sends a very distorted message to Washington that China could manipulate. So,
Well, you're not going to get me to defend KMT defense policy.
Well, I'm just being the devil's advocate over here.
And it's a problem. I think that it ultimately does stem from the notion that if you look like if you signal you're playing a weak hand, which is what America has done with regard to China, you're going to get countries in the region do things that we don't like. And if you signal that you have a strong hand, which we actually do, going back to this first question about the economy, then there's going to be less and less of these silly games played by political parties in countries that are our allies. It's just as simple as that. With regard to the 92 consensus, no one can say what the 92 consensus is. I mean, there's no consensus on what the 92 consensus is, so obviously it doesn't exist. It's one of these things which I think that, when you start to just think about it analytically, it was a word game which both China and Taiwan were willing to play to get themselves over a particular point in history, and that's what it did. But it has no more significance than that. Because at the end of the day, when you can't say that everybody agrees what the 92 consensus is, then by definition, it no longer exists and may never existed in the first place.
That reminds me of Jeff Bader, one of his other famous statements. And I actually like Jeff quite a bit. He's been very supportive of us with our ambassador program in the past. But one time he was asked by the newspaper reporter, well, what is the what is the one China policy? And he said, well, I can't tell you what it is, but I can tell you what it isn't. So, I mean, we don't even understand our own policy. And I think that's important for us to, as we're talking to members of Congress and while we're in Washington, to say what the policy actually says is the United States acknowledges there is but one China, and that basically the Chinese on both sides of the straits will determine what that is. They never talk about the Taiwanese, and we don't ever say we agree. So it becomes difficult in Washington. In fact, in our last hearing, there was a question asked of Kurt Campbell, if you remember this, and Kurt, a legislator from here, from Taiwan or from California, asked him a question, and Kurt Campbell couldn't answer it. So he's like, I'll have to get back to you on that. And that was the Reagan's 6 assurances. He couldn't name them all. And I was just happy that the 6 assurances got mentioned again after since 10 or 15 years. But we have our own policy code words as well. But unfortunately, when it comes to Taiwan and Washington, the greater clarity that we have at least gets the attention, because if we're mixed messaging all the time, then nobody wants to pay Taiwan any attention, because it is not necessarily always on the front burner, which we're grateful for, because that would mean there were big problems in Taiwan if we're on the front burner. Other questions? Right here? There?
This one right over here.
Go ahead. Do this. Then we'll do it.
It's Evan, like Papa member. I'm very happy to hear that you are optimistic about Taiwan, but I'm kind of not optimistic. I don't think, I'm afraid we may not have a chance to win next president election. And I don't think election is fair. You know, I think the play field is not at level. The KMT has so much asset. And also, more importantly, we get so much influence with the Chinese because of investment in China. Also now the Chinese come investment in Taiwan. So there's interconnected economically. So eventually we may lose the vote. And we never, you know, KMT never have a chance. What do you think?
You know, I'm not.
I mean, DDP don't have a chance.
Right. You know, when you think about it, the DPP never had a chance in 2000 either. And I think it's important that even though that there is more economic integration between China and Taiwan, what we have seen is when you do polling of people in Taiwan about their attitudes on China, that there is less support for unification. You know, unification never gets above 12%, and usually it's below 10%. The number of people who consider themselves to be Taiwanese first or Taiwanese only continues to go up. And so ultimately the KMT is playing a losing game because of just attitudes on the island. And that's an important fact. So the KMT can continue to win elections, but as long as Taiwan remains separate and apart from China, it's almost game over for Beijing, because essentially you have this drift which is almost inexorable and almost irreversible of continuing Taiwan identity. And as long as, you know, the country maintains, I don't want to use the phrase, but I'll just use it because it's a shorthand way of doing it, but status quo, it really means that Taiwan's separate and apart society continues longer. And that creates the sense on the island that they are their own country, that they are not part of China. So that's, I think, a good thing. You know, you're right about it, that the KMT with black gold and all its assets, you know, you're not going to have a fair election. But you got to remember, think about if you're in the KMT. Here you have sort of staked your policy on closer integration with China as the Chinese economy continues to plumb new depths. You know, at the end of 2011, they were supposedly growing at 8.9% in the fourth quarter. They were supposed to be growing 9.2% for the entire year. As much as that was off from 2010's 10.4%. The Chinese economy in January and February was growing somewhere between 3 and 4, maybe 5% at the most. And I can run through the analysis for you. And as I said, the initial indications from March show that the economy has deteriorated. Every analyst in Asia is now saying that the Chinese economy is falling faster than anybody would have thought. And the only thing that can really save the Chinese economy right now is policy support, which Beijing doesn't seem to be giving. So, you know, you're in the KMT and you sponsor closer integration with an economy that's falling apart, in a political system where you got essentially one army invading another province, and you're saying we want to be part of that? I don't think so. You know, the Taiwanese are not stupid. And so I think that the KMT has a position that's going to be very difficult for them to maintain. Now, to just go to your broader point about the pessimism, you know, China's, as I said, for 35 years has been growing like gangbusters. And so we tend to think that it's going to continue that way forever. But just think about it. I mean, we thought that same thing about, I graduated college in 1973. I knew that when I got out of school, I was going to be working for Arabs for the rest of my life, because that was the height of the Arab oil embargo. And how about the end of the 1980s? You know, Japan was supposed to take over the world. You know, it was the Japanese century. What happened? The problem is that the Chinese economy, and China itself, is just about going as far as it can within its existing political framework, and we have hit a top. And it's now on the way down. And that perception has not yet fully filtered through to people. But come 2 or 3 months from now, it's going to be really evident. And that's when we're going to be saying, oh yeah, of course it's not the Chinese century. What were we thinking? No, I never thought that. You know, so it is just, look at the trajectory of Chinese society. It is following, you know, it's following Japan, it's doing all sorts of things. And at the end of the day, you know, put aside all the economic and political analysis, you know, of smart people, supposedly smart people. What you got is that the basic human instinct is want to have say in your own lives, to be free, to, you know, to be able to raise your kids and not have to worry about your government too much and all the rest of it. And so China's running a system, as Havel said, that is against human nature. And those systems can last a long time. The Soviet Union lasted 70 years. And the People's Republic has been around, what, 63? But they don't last because they go against what people want. The Chinese people don't want their system. And we know that because the Communist Party spends so much money in terms of coercing them, of cutting off discourse, of telling the Chinese people what to do, and they don't like it. So that means at some point that system cannot survive. And when that system doesn't survive, when it falls apart, which I think will be soon, then people in Taiwan will have more space to have the society that they want and to have it recognized by other people around the world. That, if anything, is inevitable. I can be wrong on timing, but that is the result.
And Amy has in her hand the microphone. So let's make it good, Amy. Good show here for us.
Oh, this is just when the Formosa Foundation first went to Washington with the ambassador program, it was in 2003. And for several years, we always came across conversation. Every time we had a conversation with congressional staff, we get response back from the staffers about keeping the status quo. Okay, and so we build into our program teaching our kids what the status quo means, what it stands for, and what's wrong with this. So our kids can very much articulate. Every time they come up with that vernacular, they could respond appropriately. But in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, I have not had any experience running into responses that include that word. So I'm very curious, has the administration or the policymakers dropped that word from the political mindset? Is it because we made progress as a whole, or has something changed?
Well, you know, 3 or 4 years ago, I don't think things had changed yet, but we're clearly seeing the change now. You know, you're dealing with a president right now who, whether you like him or you don't like him, he doesn't really want to be bothered by foreign policy issues. He's really focused in on domestic concerns. And so essentially, at this point, although they might not use the word status quo, they just don't want a problem from Taiwan, which I think is really why they gave Ma Ying-jeou some help in December with that FT interview. But the problem for the administration right now is that they're being forced to confront China issues that they didn't want to have to deal with. And so there is going to be, I think, in a fairly short period of time, just a re-examination of everything. And this whole concept of status quo will go out the window because it will be so inappropriate for what's actually happening in the region. We haven't seen such a major change in China policy as we started to see last November. And that's really important because that opens up the door to Taiwan.
Jerry, can I have last question? I just want to ask the hottest topic, American B. You know, we just lost one most important senator in the Capitol Hill, and his name is Max Baucus. And the reason he, not joined the Taiwan caucus because Taiwanese are not buying American beef anymore. And is that such a big deal? What's your opinion on this?
Even with caucus going, it is a big deal. It's going to remain a big deal, not just for Taiwan, but for other countries as well. And I think that essentially what we're going to see is American ranchers basically having to change the way they approach their customers around the world. So I see them giving in. I mean, the only solution for this is for Jeremy Lin to become involved in the beef fishing. But short of that, this is going to take some time to be worked out. But it's an issue of what the customers want. And so eventually, those types of issues in trade matters normally get resolved by the people who buy. So I see that coming. Nonetheless, this is not going away this year or next year. I can be optimistic about a lot of things, like the Communist Party rolling about. But beef issue, you got to take it with a little bit of time because this is going to take a long time to resolve.
Well, I certainly appreciate all of the questions and the very thoughtful, insightful answers here. I guess it's just a final point from myself. I've been in politics a very long time, and I have seen factional fighting, and I have seen ups and downs, and I have been beaten very badly in campaigns, very badly by the Supreme Court one time. So the beautiful part about a democracy and the beautiful part about the system that is both here in the United States and in Taiwan is it always can change. It always can change. I've been the underdog many times and outspent and out-talked, but when you get people, and I just say this to anyone in Taiwan, when you have people out there voting, and particularly in my case, young people, when I think about the young people in Taiwan, the world is going to change, and it's going to go towards, this ideal of democracy. Because, as Gordon says, no one wishes for the collapse of any country. We want a collapse of the bad systems, and I think that young people are going to be what leads it, forward. In a lot of places, I think there was a lot of hope in the Middle East, in Egypt, and now we're seeing a backsliding. That's what happens in politics. But you cannot give up. You can never give up the ideal, whether you're outspent or outspoken. In our own country, we should be horrified, in my opinion, that we have individuals putting so much money in our political system. That is unfair. That is not what our country's about. It's about one person, one vote. And that's where we need to go back to, in my opinion. But as far as Taiwan, I am very optimistic about it because I think they're right. Taiwan is right, and when you're right, you're always ahead of the game. And number two, I wanted just to say that I really think that Gordon is kind of a little bit like Nostradamus. He was talking about how the conversation is going to shift in Washington. And we've been working at the Formosa Foundation, and it'll be apparent in the next 4 months about the conversational shift. So if we're able to pull off this conversational shift, you're going to start seeing it, as Gordon said, to talk about democracy, talk about human rights again. It's really important, and it's timely in Washington. And then finally, the program that we run, the Ambassador Program, is tremendously expensive. We do it on a shoestring with volunteers, Amy, Joanne, others. We have former ambassadors that fly in at their own expense to act as facilitators. But even in that context, it runs about $60,000 to $80,000 a year, depending on how many students we bring to the program. So we need your support. We need your financial support. We need your moral support. We need you to rally every young person you know to start, getting on our Facebook page. We are very much first in line to move new media. We Twitter, we're on Facebook, we have 3 Facebook pages actually, we're on YouTube, we're always out there spreading the message, but really it is these young people that are always making a big difference. If you don't believe it, think about this. This Trayvon Williams case, which is a tragedy, has really spread through new media. and you're seeing conversations based on it. The same kind of conversations that we could be having about democracy in Taiwan and freedom and human rights that we should all be having. But in the end, please help us continue our program. There's some, you can always donate on the website. You can talk to any of our Formosa Foundation directors or myself or Iris, or you can even fill out that little brochure in the back. But we really appreciate it and need all your help. Thank you so much.